Our scripture reading this morning is from Isaiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 10. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad, the desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then the lame shall leap like deer, and the tongue of the speechless sing for joy. For water shall break forth in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water. The haunts of jackals shall become a swamp. The grass shall become reeds and rushes. A highway shall be there, and it shall be called the Holy Way. The unclean shall not travel on it, but it shall be for God's people. No traveler, not even fools, shall go astray. No lion shall be there, nor shall any ravenous beast come upon it. They shall not be found there, but the redeemed shall walk there. And the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with singing. Everlasting joy shall be upon their heads. They shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away.
Last week, we compared the similarities of the Old Testament story of Sarah and her later than average pregnancy and birth of her son Isaac to the New Testament story of Elizabeth and her later than average pregnancy and birth of her son John. And the lesson for both of these stories was don't give up hope. Dare to believe that the impossible is possible. So this week I want to do another Old Testament story, New Testament story comparison. But this time I want to take you back to the 1400s. And I'm not talking 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. I'm talking 1,400 years before Christ was born. And the reigning superpower in the Middle East was Egypt. And during this time, there was an increasing number of Hebrew people that were living in Egypt. And these Hebrew people were descendants of Joseph. And Joseph was a Hebrew person who had helped Egypt survive through this really bad famine in the land. And so Joseph and these Hebrew people settled in the land of Goshen in Egypt. Well, there came a time when a new Pharaoh came into power, and this Pharaoh conveniently forgot all the great things that Joseph did to help get Egypt out of that famine. And so what this new Pharaoh saw was all these Hebrew people living in Egypt. And Pharaoh thought, this is scary. He was thinking, there's starting to be more of them than there are of us. So I've got to do something about this. I've got to come up with a solution, or else these people are going to take over. So he thought and he thought, and he says, I'll build a wall. And then he realized, no, can't do that, because they're already here, and I know, I'll deport them. And then he realized, no, can't do that, because there's just too darn many of them. So he thought and he thought and he thought, and he says, I know what we'll do. We'll make them slaves. And so that's what he did. He enslaved all these Hebrew people, and these Hebrew people started building temples and cities and things like that. But the problem was, even under this oppression, even as slaves, these Hebrew people kept growing and growing. They still had children. And pretty soon, there was a fair amount of Hebrew phobia in the land. And so Pharaoh came up with this really weird idea. He gathered the midwives in that area together. And he says, here's what I want you to do, you Egyptian midwives. You all are loyal to Egypt, right? The midwives are like, oh, heck yeah, Egypt, hoorah. But then he said, this is what I want you to do. I want you to kill every baby boy. When a Hebrew woman gives birth to a baby boy, I want you to kill that baby boy. And the Hebrew midwife, or the Egyptian midwives were like, okay. And they went off and got together and said, we're not going to do this, but we've got to come up with an excuse to tell Pharaoh. So they went back to Pharaoh and says, listen, Pharaoh, I've got to tell you something about these Hebrew women. When they give birth to a baby, it's like they don't need our help. These Hebrew women are tough. They don't need midwives. And so Pharaoh thought, and he said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll just tell every citizen of Egypt to kill any baby boy that is born, to drown them in the Nile River. And that's when we learn about this one baby boy that was born to a Hebrew woman, and that Hebrew woman took this baby, hid him in a basket in the reeds of the Nile River, and let him just kind of float down the Nile River until this baby was found and given to the Pharaoh's daughter, and that daughter raised this baby to be a prince of Egypt. And that baby's name was Moses. And that got the ball rolling to one of the most important stories in the Old Testament. And that is Moses saving the Hebrew people by leading them out of an exodus, leading them on an exodus out of Egypt so that they can settle in this promised land of Canaan. And that's what they did. They settled there and became the nation of Israel.
Version 1.
Version 1, yeah, really.
There is a version 2.
Yes. But we won't get into that one this morning because again, I'm making a comparison here. So what I want you to do is I want you to fast forward to the first century in the Common Era. And here we are. Here's the nation of Israel still in the Promised Land, having gone through version 1.2, 2.2. They went through a lot of incarnations. They had survived the Babylonian captivity. But right now, in the first century, they were under Roman rule. And the Romans had a really interesting way of governing. See, the Romans were brutal. They weren't good people. They ruled with an iron fist, but they wanted their subjects to think that they were all cuddly and full of grace and mercy. So what they would do is they'd set up these indigenous kings in each one of their little provinces to kind of keep the people happy, or at least that was the idea. So the king that was the king of the Jews in this province was Herod the Great. Herod was also known as Herod the Builder because one of his biggest projects, one of the best projects that he accomplished was rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And let me tell you, in size and scale and scope, this temple rivaled the first temple that King Solomon built during the heyday of Israel, during Israel's most prominent and powerful time, which you would think would make Herod kind of a hero, right? The problem is Herod was a jerk. I mean, on a global scale, jerk. And the thing is, he was often referred to as the puppet king because it was the Roman Empire that were pulling the strings of Herod. He did just about anything they said that they asked him, told him to do. So, he was a brutal ruler too. This is what else made Herod a jerk. He was a brutal ruler, and anybody who crossed him, anybody who stepped in his way, he would eliminate. And I'm talking even members of his own family, his own flesh and blood. He would kill them if they got in his way, or if he even thought they were going to get in his way. So even though the idea behind setting this guy up as king of the Jews was to appease the people, what it ended up doing is that the Jews hated both the Romans and Herod. And that meant that the Jews were still putting their desires and dreams and hopes in a Messiah who would come in and save the people of Israel from the corrupt leaders and usher in this new kingdom that would be modeled after the greatest kingdom of Israel, and that is the kingdom under King David. Now, Herod the Great, for all his bad guyness, was not a fool. He wasn't clueless. So he knew the people weren't happy. And he knew that they were still praying for this Messiah to come and rescue them from their current situation. So one day, some magi from the east, is what we read in the Bible, which meant they were probably Zoroastrian astrologers from the Persian region. They came on into Jerusalem, and they were asking him about this child who was born in Bethlehem. And this child was the prophesied King of the Jews. Now, how do you think Herod felt about that? Not very good at all, because remember, Herod was a very insecure person. So the last thing he wanted was for someone to grow up and challenge him for the throne, to be the king of the Jews. Because at that point, the people of Israel would have favored a chimpanzee over him on the throne, right? And so Herod said, well, I tell you what, how about you guys go find him? And, when you go to Bethlehem and find him and you know where he is, why don't you come on back and tell me where he is so that I can worship him? Yeah, that's it, worship him. And so then the Magi went off to Bethlehem and they found Jesus. But you know what? They saw right through Herod. They knew he was up to no good. And so they did not report back to him, which infuriated Herod. And so Herod came up with an idea. He sent his men to Bethlehem to kill every baby under the age of 2 that was born. But by then, Joseph, another Joseph, as in Joseph and Mary, that's interesting, fled to Egypt, irony of ironies, so that they could protect Jesus. Do you see the similarities in the stories here? Because you've got two very powerful yet very insecure rulers who are willing to kill children so that they can stay in power. Here's the sad thing. It's probably the saddest thing in this whole story. Even though Herod was a puppet of the Roman Empire, he was still a Jew. Okay? He was a descendant of the very people who were enslaved in Egypt under Pharaoh, and yet he was doing the exact same brutal, horrible, unspeakable things that Pharaoh did to his own people, to Herod's people, to the Jews. The descendant of the Hebrew slaves was acting like a slave master himself. Herod was supposed to protect the people. He was supposed to preserve their dignity as God's people. For crying out loud, he was supposed to be the good guy in this story, right? But because he had been given enough power and enough provocation, he ended up acting like the bad guy. In fact, the most notorious bad guy in the history of Israel. Which leads us to the question, how are we any different than Herod? When we are given power and we feel like we're being provoked, would we behave any different than him? And this whole story lays out an even more important question, and this is the question I want to lay out on the table this morning. How do we manage power, and how do we deal with violence? Okay? Herod and Pharaoh show us that violence is a tool to either gain power or to maintain power. And yet the baby who Herod wanted to kill modeled another way. His tool is service, not violence. His goal isn't to gain or maintain power. His goal is to empower others. His vision is reflected more in the innocence and vulnerability of children than in the violence of men. Okay, so then let's take this a step further and think about how this applies today. Okay, the next war, whoever wages it, whatever weapons they use, whatever, the next war will resemble every other war in the past. And here's how it will resemble any other war. It's going to be planned and started by powerful older men who are comfortable in their offices, and it will be fought by people who are the age of their children and their grandchildren. Now, and most of the casualties in any war are between the ages of 18 and 22. Legally adults, but still kids, right? Especially by today's standards. Now, a large number of the ones who will fight the battles will be poor. They'll probably be coming from communities where the only opportunity that they have to break that cycle of poverty is to go into the military, which is fine. That is a good option for a lot of kids. That's an option that my middle child is wanting to take now. Hallelujah. But that does not change the fact that they are obligated to follow those who waged the war, those older men who are insecure and want to keep power. So, history then repeats itself, right? As it has generation after generation. So the story of Herod and the slaughter of children is going to be played out again, and again, mothers will weep at the loss of their children. So the sacrifice of children for the well-being and security of adults has a long, long history throughout the world. There was an ancient religion in the Middle East that dedicated themselves to an idol named Moloch. And every year the followers of Moloch would sacrifice infants to this idol of Moloch. They figured that by doing so they would appease Moloch's wrath, thus earning his favor, and therefore not dealing with famine or whatever natural disaster that would just normally come along. But you know, the beautiful thing about the Bible is the Bible takes some of these sick and twisted traditions from all these other weird religions in the Middle East and turns them completely around. I know earlier this year I was talking about the symbol of the rainbow and how it was completely changed from the original meaning. See, originally, if you saw a rainbow in the sky, that was supposed to strike fear into your hearts, because in the Babylonian religion, that rainbow symbolized the bow of Marduk. And so if you saw a bow in the sky, a rainbow in the sky, that was supposed to remind you, hey, if you ever cross the Babylonians, you're going to get wiped completely off the face of the earth. But then, in the Bible, what does the rainbow symbolize? God will never wipe us off the face of the earth. So it was completely turned around. And in the same way, as in this story of Moloch, of the people who worship Moloch, God doesn't require appeasement like Moloch does. You don't need to sacrifice children to win favor with God. In fact, God embodies mature, true, loving parenthood. Parenthood that is self-giving for the sake of one's own children. It is not about sacrificing children for your own selfish interests. It is good for us to wrestle with these, with what we believe about God when we're faced with challenging circumstances. Because we have to ask, does God promote or demand violence? Does God favor the sacrifice of children for the well-being of adults? Is God best reflected in the image of a powerful old man who sends the young and vulnerable off to die on their behalf? Or is God seen in the image of a baby in a manger? Think about that. One who identifies with the marginalized, one who shares their vulnerability. See, we don't live in an ideal world, right? No doubt there. To be alive in the adventure of Jesus is to face some tough and sometimes uncomfortable moments when we have to ask, how am I going to respond? Am I going to respond with violence? Am I going to respond by seeing other people as disposable? Necessary collateral in the fight to maintain power? Or by withholding our consent with the powerful in order to invest in the vulnerable? In other words, do we side with the Herods of the world and their ruthless regimes, or do we reserve our loyalty for a better king and a better kingdom? And so to wrestle with these questions is why we need to keep the story of Herod in this beautiful story of Christmas. Because you might be thinking, oh, good grief, Jesse, it's Christmas season. You're talking about people who kill babies? It's in here. It's in the Christmas story. And it is in this Christmas story where we see why we need to wrestle with these. So in this season of Advent, we can say Jesus has truly come. But each year during the Advent season, we acknowledge that the dream for which he gave his all has not fully come yet. And as long as elites plot violence, as long as children pay the price, as long as mothers weep, we can't be satisfied. So let us light a candle this morning for the children who suffer in our world because of the greedy and the power hungry.